Okay, hello there, everyone, and welcome to today's University Business Web Seminar. It's great to have you all with us. My name is Kurt Isley-Durley. I'm the Web Seminar Editor here at UB. Thanks so much for joining us today. The title of today's webinar, as you see here, is Getting Started Online, Research-Based Practices to Support Quality Teaching and Learning, and is being brought to you through the generous support of our sponsor for today, D2L. First off, before we get started, as members of our audience are still coming in here, a bit of background about our topic and what we'll be taking a look at here today. Many institutions have, of course, had to make a sudden transition to online learning over the past few months. But even under ideal circumstances, making the transition from in-person teaching and learning to an online environment is a big step. There are so many factors to consider, it's easy to feel overwhelmed. So with that said, how do you start making important decisions about tools, teaching strategies, and assessment options? Today we're joined by two instructional design experts who will discuss some research-based best practices and effective strategies for moving any college or university to an online teaching and learning environment. We're looking forward to an interesting presentation and discussion here, plus live Q&A. We welcome your questions, so do stay tuned. I'll get started here in just a minute. Before we do, though, just some standard housekeeping notes here. First item, as it says, for tech support, you can use the chat panel at the right side of your screen there. Just select the name of our event host and producer, Jason York, and send him your message. If you're having any technical problems at any time, he'll be able to help you out there. Also, second item, if you do need, if you have any audio trouble at any time, we will post the phone number and access code in that chat panel at the right side of your screen there. You can dial those at any time to get audio access over the phone. As I said earlier, we welcome your questions. At any time, you can feel free to type in a question for our presenters here in the Q&A at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen there. You see that Q&A box. Put your questions there, not in the chat window, but in the Q&A. Feel free to ask a question at any time. We're going to be pausing for Q&A at some different parts throughout the presentation, as well at the end of the presentation. So once again, if you have a question at any time, feel free to type it in that Q&A bottom right-hand corner there. Also, speaking of questions, last item on the slide here, we are very often asked about accessing the content of the presentation at a later time, either the slides or the archive recording. And yes, as it says here, everyone who registered or attended here today will be getting a follow-up email later on with links to where you can view the archive recording as well as download the slides. So if you want to go back over the presentation, or if you want to share with anyone at your institution, anyone on your team or your faculty, you'll be able to do that later on, so don't worry about that. Okay, so with that, on to our program. As I said earlier, we're very fortunate to welcome two instructional design experts here. Darcy White is an instructional designer at D2L, and Chris Sessoms is Director of Academic Affairs, also at D2L. And they have a great presentation and discussion lined up here for you. Again, we welcome your questions. Feel free to use at the bottom right-hand corner. Submit them in the Q&A. But I'll turn it over to Chris at this point. As always, Chris, it's great to have you. Welcome to our webinar.
Thank you, Kurt. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And hi again, and welcome to Getting Started Online, Research-Based Practices to Support Quality Teaching and Learning. I'm your host, Chris Sessoms. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs at D2L, as Kurt said. I want to thank you again for joining us. In today's session, we are going to focus on transitioning to teaching online. And given that there are many, many ways to consider this topic, today we thought we'd zero in on some research-based practices that we use here in our own shop at D2L by our very own Dr. Darcy White, as was mentioned, as an instructional designer here at D2L. So, that's me. So to follow up on what Kurt was saying, a few housekeeping rules here. Before we get started, this is how we're gonna do this. We'll jump directly into our topic at hand here shortly, and I'll break about every 5 to 7 minutes for questions from participants. So don't be shy. This is an opportunity to ask us anything about teaching and learning online. Darcy and I have been doing this for quite a while and try to approach instructional design with a beginner's mindset so that we don't assume too much and it keeps us curious. So no question is too silly or too out of bounds. So let's just jump right in. So years ago, when I first started supporting distance learning initiatives, online learning was a taboo subject in the halls of most higher education institutions. But that's not the case anymore. For many instructors, the move online has presented too many obstacles, and it didn't look and feel like teaching and learning. And the transactional distance becomes pretty apparent very quickly, as most online learning experiences didn't permit you early on to see students face-to-face or read their body language or indeed even have everybody in the same room at the same time. And this led many to claim that online learning was an inferior quality. It was inferior value compared with face-to-face teaching. And it was too complex, too time-consuming, and not worth the effort or aggravation. And it was quite a disruption to the college instructional model. And let's face it, teaching online is not what a majority of faculty members signed up for when they entered the profession. So it's time-consuming to learn a new system, and there's very little empirical research early on to show that, as I mentioned in the beginning stages of moving online, that it was at least as effective as face-to-face teaching. But online learning is no longer an option in education, and to meet the demands of our modern world that will continuously place on our education systems, we need to be better prepared. So today I want to start at the beginning. Let's say that I'm a mathematician and a college professor, and I've been teaching face-to-face in my physical classroom for 17 years. And I love my subject, but it is a difficult one that many students have a hard time understanding. Now, I use a textbook and I give lectures twice a week, and I've never really taught online, and frankly, nor have I really wanted to. I'm a perfectionist and can be very hard on myself. But I'm curious, now that I'm being asked to move online, where do I begin? And will I be doing this in stages? Am I starting with video? How will I be sure my students aren't cheating on tests? Like, where do I start? So to help me through all these questions, I've asked my colleague, Dr. Darcy White, a professional instructional designer at D2L, to give me a hand. Darcy, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and where you come from and what you do at D2L?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So like Chris said, I'm an instructional designer here at D2L, which means that I work directly with clients and subject matter experts, and I make course design recommendations grounded in best practices in online course design and pedagogy, with the ultimate goal here of offering learners the best possible online learning experience. And a bit more about my background. Before working as an instructional designer, I got my PhD in cognitive psychology from the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. So with this background and the research studies that I've been involved with, looking at how to best motivate learners online and increase learning outcomes, I'm always coming at these recommendations from an evidence-based perspective, like Chris was talking about before. So in other words, what I'm looking at here is, what does the research tell us will work best for learners?
Well, that's good to hear. And you've probably heard my story before, Darcy. There are so many tools and functionalities to think about. How do you help someone like me when we knock on your door online? And how do you help me get started?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think people get excited about the tools that are available to them online, which is a great thing. But I think before starting to think about that, we really want to think about how online learning differs from face-to-face learning. So taking your course online, it involves more than just taking that material you have from the classroom and putting it in the online space. Of course, having that engaging, high-quality content is a great starting point, but I think an even better starting point for us to focus on today is your online presence as an instructor. So what I mean by that is, when you're in a face-to-face environment, you have all those built-in opportunities to share your personality, connect with learners, and clarify those points of confusion. You can read the room a bit more. Someone might put their hand up and ask you a question. And this is, this is one key difference in online learning. So if you're not pre-designing the course with your opportunities for interaction in mind, then you might be missing these chances you have to make connections with your learners. And as a result of that, to really boost motivation and learning outcomes as a result.
So this is an interesting way for us to think about, I grew up with this term transactional distance. A shout out to Dr. Moore there at Penn State. And when thinking about transactional distance, I'm thinking about our students in the dining room and me in my dining room, and how to best sort of breach that or facilitate that distance. So it sounds like thinking about presence is one way to do that.
Yeah, so thinking about presence is one way of doing that for sure. I think that a common misconception that a lot of us have heard about online learning is that it's isolating, but it really doesn't have to be. I think that, and research shows that taking the time to actually build your presence in an online course can make a world of difference for your learners. It can motivate them to actually keep up with the content, increase learning outcomes like I mentioned before. It also makes them feel supported. It's easier for learners to reach out to an instructor who they feel more connected to.
Well, that makes sense. So tell me, how can I build an online course that will maximize my presence and student engagement? Is there specific steps I need to take? And what does research tell us?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think a good way of thinking about this is breaking this down into what you can do before a course runs, what you can do during a course offer, and then what you can do at the end of a course. So as you can see here, before a course runs, one of the first things you want to think about is making a plan for yourself. And what I mean by that is, putting together a list of goals for yourself, communication goals or connection building goals for yourself before going into actually building that online course. And some things you can do is, you can preset dates you want to reach out to learners to make sure you're hitting those goals, reaching out regularly to build that connection. Deciding how often you're going to actually check in to the online course. So maybe you want to check in once a day to see if any questions have been asked or what's going on with learners if you have a discussion going on. You'll also want to think about setting your goals for turnaround time. So if you are having discussions online, how quickly do you want to make sure you're checking and responding to learners? How quickly do you want to make sure that you're giving them feedback on assessments, that kind of thing?
That makes a lot of sense. So I love that you start with a plan. So when you're building an online course, this is something that you really have to map out first. And you mentioned that I should probably think about mapping out when I'm going to interact and engage with students. I think that's really fascinating. I hadn't really thought about that before.
Yeah, and I mean, creating a plan, I know we're talking about engaging with learners right now and creating that instructor presence, but a quick aside about this too, creating a plan for your course should ideally also include that loose structure of the overall course, what the learning goals are, outcomes, topics, assessments, and everything else that you might include in a course, just because it makes it easier to organize your thoughts and make sure that you're covering everything that you really want to throughout the course.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate that. What I'd like to do right now, if it's possible, before we move forward, I know we have a few questions there in our chat, so I'd like to jump into those. But can you tell us a little bit more about interaction techniques? Is there a way for me to keep interaction and engagement simple yet effective? Do you know what I mean? Like, what can I do that I'm not reinventing the wheel or spending a lot of time maybe unnecessarily. Is there a way to think about that?
This kind of gets into some of the other points that are on this slide here. The next one you'll see there is using a narrative format. And what I mean here is just making sure that you're using a conversational tone throughout the content. This is something that, I mean, if you think about what you would normally say in the classroom, that's a great starting point. So you already have that in mind. I don't want to call it your script, but normally what you'd walk through in the classroom, you can use that as a basis for this to save yourself time. And what that does is it really helps build that connection with your learners through the content. And it makes it more engaging to read content that's in that narrative format for the learner as well. A couple of other quick wins listed here. To share your personality, you can do something like create an instructor profile right off the beginning of the course to build that connection right away. So just a bit about yourself, your background, maybe some of your interests to build that connection with learners. And then when you're talking about the opportunities for interaction, you can think about having discussions that you're checking into regularly to reduce your workload and have a quick win there. You can think about making sure that you have these minimum goals for yourself. So maybe you only want to make sure you're responding to at least one learner or two learners for each discussion. So you're not trying to tackle everything that's happening in the online course, but you're still showing that you're online.
Gotcha. Oh, that's handy. Well, listen, there's some really good other questions here that I want to jump into, Darcy. This is from Ken, and he asks, my physics students tell me that the primary motivation comes from classmate interaction. That the professor maintains the development, moves in a reasonable direction, is confident in confidence rather than motivation. How do I maintain motivation in an online environment? Oh, that's a good question.
That is a good question. I know we're going to talk about engagement a bit more later on, but if we're thinking about that learner-to-learner interaction, this is where you can think about things like using online discussion tools to get them talking to one another. You could think about potentially exploring some collaborative assignments or group assignments that they can still work together in the online space. There are a lot of tools available to do that. So things like, if you think about Google Docs or something like that, where you can work at the same time as your peers and be in that space together, there are still ways to incorporate that online. So just making sure that you're trying to get that learner-to-learner interaction going. Another way of doing that is if you are having discussions, think about dividing your learners into smaller discussion groups throughout a course. This makes it a bit easier to participate than, say, if you had a class of 200 students. If you're making them talk in discussion groups of 5, it makes it a lot easier for people to share with one another, and they build those relationships across the course if they're in the same group over time.
Gotcha. Another interesting question here that it's an interesting one to think about. Paul asks, how do we help students who are oral learners, as in oral through the ear learners in an asynchronous environment, fully online courses?
That is another very good question. So we are going to touch on formats a bit later on when we're talking about engagement again, but one thing I would encourage you to do in any online course is take advantage of the fact that you can present the content in a variety of formats. So, it really lends itself well to having maybe a text-based course that has other media types worked in. So maybe there's some content that you think would work well as a YouTube video, which has some of that auditory piece in it, or recording yourself giving a mini hot topic lecture as a podcast format, that kind of thing. So that you're still, targeting some of those more auditory learners, but you still have text-based visuals, a variety of formats to accommodate other learner preferences as well.
Gotcha. And I'm going to go one more question, then we'll jump back in. William asks, my favorite courses have a large element of chaos to them. How do you prevent the constant pressure of planning and formatting from replacing all the improvisatory space with scripting and structure?
I don't know that I've ever heard a course described in that way before, but I like it. Yeah, I think that you can still, even if it's mostly structured, you can set aside time to have some of those more impromptu conversations. So you can think about things like even if the course is mostly asynchronous, you could have a scheduled virtual check-in once a week where people can just come in and talk about the content. Maybe you poll learners to see what they want to talk about that day and make it a bit loose, a little bit less structured in that way. That being said, I do think there is benefit to having a bit more structure in an online course just because it helps set expectations for learners up front. They know what's expected of them in that online course. And it gives you more time to build that connection with them. If you already have existing content in there, you get to spend a lot more time, reaching out to learners, checking in, giving that quality feedback.
Very good. Well, I appreciate that, Darcy. So let's move forward then in our presentation. Now, once my course is up and running, what are some things I need to think about or keep top of mind?
So we've already talked about checking in often in that initial slide there, so I won't touch on that too much. The main point here is really just making sure that you can keep a pulse on what's going on in the course and see if learners need your help at all in that online space. And that ties into the next point that's there too, which is offering support. So something that we'll often recommend an instructor do in their online courses include some sort of Ask the Instructor forum. This is a great spot for learners to pop in with questions if there's a sticking point in the content and ask you, the instructor, for your feedback. And it reduces the amount of questions you're getting via email because other learners will see that a question's already been posted in there, and they'll also see that you're responding. So then you're getting that presence built up again without necessarily needing to respond to as many individual questions. And the other piece here too is making sure that, when you're giving learners feedback, you're offering them more of I'll say personalized experience here. I'm popping into that next point a bit, but showing learners that you're showing up for them in that instructor forum through the personalized feedback you're writing for them on assessments, it makes it easier for them to show up for you, which is feedback I've gotten before in one of the studies I was involved with at University of Waterloo. A lot of learners just, when their instructor shows that they're showing up for them, it makes them feel like they need to show up for them as well.
Well, that's really good to hear. That's kind of related to a motivation question, I think, that we were discussing earlier, and something that I know it almost feels jargony to say the word personalized when I think of online learning. I know it's a favorite of marketers in our space. Can you tell me a little bit more about what is personalizing and what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so I touched on feedback a bit there for that point, but really what you want to do there is kind of create that personal experience for the learner, give them a bit of individualized experience in that course. So the feedback that you give is just one example. Something else you could do too is you could think of, maybe if you have an assignment in the course, you give them some choice over one of two topics to talk about. So you're showing them that they have some choice in their learning there, which makes it feel a bit more personalized as well. You can also think of setting up reminders that go out to learners based on something they do or don't do in the course. So I know at D2L we call these release conditions, but it might be called something different elsewhere. Essentially, you can have these conditions that a learner meets that then releases some content based on that. So for instance, if I'm a learner and maybe I don't do too well on a specific quiz, I get 60% or something like that, maybe you have a condition that when I'm at that threshold, I get remedial content. So that's one way you can personalize the experience for learners.
Gotcha. So personalizing, is it the same as individualizing in that sense? I guess it is. I'm answering my own question. Making it personal is making it individual, and I think sometimes I get confused when I see, I need to personalize the experience. What does that really mean? But it sounds like you're telling me that it's just offering support, checking in, being present in the process. Is there a time? Is there a fair time limit on this? Like, if I'm waiting a long time, delaying before I respond to a student or in a post, say, for example, Does that have an effect on the level of personalization?
I would say that that does have an effect on, that presence as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Something that I'd recommend doing when you are making that plan for your course is thinking about, like I mentioned before, those turnaround times. So if you set a goal that if a learner emails you, you want to make sure you're responding within 24 to 48 hours. I
Mm-hmm.
would actually encourage you to share that timeline with the learners in the course. That
Gotcha.
way, if it's been more than 24 but less than 48, they don't start to have that internal panic that maybe you're not going to respond because they know there's that window there.
Boy, that makes sense. And yeah, I put myself in the student's shoes as soon as you said that and thought, yeah, where are you? I'm waiting for a response. So I get it. That makes a lot of sense, Darcy. Thanks. So we've talked about keeping it running. I guess we should be thinking about what to do as the course winds up and after it's over. Do you have any suggestions for me there?
Yeah, so for after a course runs, um, I would say that gathering feedback from learners is one of the most critical things you can do to find out how you can enhance that learner experience. You can get that read of what's working well from that, what's working well for them, what's not, which is especially important when you're first putting together online content and you're still working out that best approach for your content and your learners.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we've placed this after a course runs, but you can also think about quick check-ins throughout a course offer too.
Mm-hmm.
So something like a start, stop, continue, or asking them, what was a sticking point in this week's content? How can I help you? What other information can I give you to support you? And then with that information, if you're doing it during a course offer, you can think of ways that you might be able to adapt while the course is running. So maybe you'll get feedback about how much you're responding in discussion. That's something that's easy to change while the course is running.
Mm-hmm.
Or you might get feedback on iterating for future course offers. Maybe there's something you can't change while the course is running, but you can change it for the next time around.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense. And then, I'm a big fan of the work of Kenneth Zeichner and this idea of critical reflection. This idea of, I dare say, debriefing myself after the course. Is that something that you recommend for instructors, or how do you recommend that they sort of, what do they do at the end of the course in terms of, thinking about that course or making next steps? Is there any advice you have there?
Yeah, so beyond getting that learner feedback and acting on that, I
Mm-hmm.
think as the instructor, taking that time to kind of, critically reflect or self debrief after the course and just think about, did anything stick out to you as, maybe there was a week where there were a lot of questions from learners. What were they asking about? What can you do differently next time? Or maybe you attempted to have some open office hours, but no one ever signed up for them, some virtual office hours. So kind of thinking of a different approach you can try next time around to really enhance the experience for learners.
Well, those are really good examples, Darcy. I appreciate that. And now I want to switch gears. We're gonna go for audience questions here in just a moment. But first, I want to talk about assessment. I'm a big fan of multiple choice, but how do I do that online? And how will I know my students aren't cheating if I use that assessment method? Is there a better way for me to do this online?
Yeah, so I mean, you can definitely do multiple choice questions online if that's something that you think works best for your course content. When you're talking about, worrying about students cheating, that is a concern that we do hear quite a bit. There are a lot of ways that you can kind of mitigate those concerns or reduce the possibility that your learners are cheating if you are using those multiple choice tests. So you can think about things like setting a time limit on the test, which makes it harder for them to look things up, using a
Hmm.
question pool so that not all learners are getting the same questions. Randomizing question order and response option order, again, so it's harder if a couple of learners are sitting together to look over each other's shoulders and see what they're each putting for their answers on questions.
Hmm.
And then another point here too is there are proctoring services available online that you could look into. Some that shut down your browser so you can't look at other things online while you're taking a test, or there are some too that make learners show that there's no one else in the room with them before they take a test and have their webcam on so they're not looking at anything else. So that is definitely something you can do if that's the kind of test you want to use and you're worried about that. But I would say that as a math professor or a professor for any discipline, really, are multiple choice tests the best option for the content that you're teaching? So there might be other more meaningful ways to check your learners' understanding of the content. So you can think of, maybe in a math course, you want your learners to actually submit the steps that they went through to come to an answer to show that they've actually done that work and have a good understanding of the required calculations.
Gotcha. I want to dig a little deeper here, Doris. How can I trust that students that are taking the tests, even if I'm doing them, differently, if I'm not just doing multiple choice, how do I know that they are who they are? I mean, are there other ways I can assess learners that don't require some type of proctoring service? Because this looks like a real opportunity for me to change things up.
Yeah, so this again is going to move away from those multiple choice tests, but depending on what skills you want learners to leave your course with, you can also think of a variety of ways that you can get them actively engaged with the assessments you have in your course by making them relevant to the overall goals or outcomes of your course. So for example, let's go back to, working through a problem. So if you wanted your learners to work through problems in a team setting, for example, then you could consider having them work on a group project, which is something that we had mentioned earlier as a potential option when you want that peer-to-peer interaction. And what this does is it gives them the opportunity to interact with their peers, of course, but it also gives them the chance to brainstorm and problem solve as part of a team. Yeah, and this is, if that's what you're going for, it's a lot better of an assessment to get at this rather than a multiple choice test. And it also gives you more options in terms of how to actually assess your learners. So you can start thinking about things like peer review, so actually getting learners to weigh in on how their team members did, which gives you a bit more of a holistic picture of the individual learners' contributions to a project when they're on a group project. Another benefit of this, sorry, just one more benefit of this before moving on, is that it also reduces your workload since the learners are assessing each other as part of this, and it gives them the opportunity to practice their own review skills as well.
Now, I like that idea of peer review. I think that, I found as an instructor, if I was doing all of the work, who's learning more, me or my students? So I recognize that any chance I could have to activate my students seemed to be the one that would be most beneficial. I know many students want to just come into my class and sit and take notes and then leave. But I found when I was making them get more involved and active, they were learning more. They were performing better on tests. And but they will tell you that they didn't like that. They would prefer that I leave them alone, right?
Yeah.
Well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, it's fine. I was just going to say, yes, that's definitely feedback I've heard from learners as well. It's kind of a mix there where they do enjoy having that opportunity to show their learning in other ways, but sometimes I know there can be some things that come along with group dynamics that maybe aren't everyone's favorite as well.
Oh, gosh. Well, I want to break for questions. And first I want to sort of, I want us to think about, are there other ways to think about group or team activities? So, for example, a friend of mine is really into project-based learning. Can project-based learning be done individually? And how does that work online?
Yeah, so I would say that project-based learning I guess it depends what your ultimate goal there is. If you want it to be, you know, you're on a team project and you're seeing how those interactions take place, then I would recommend a group assignment. But if you just want to see how an individual would put together um, a project or written document, something like that, you can use assignments to do that online, just like you could in the classroom, and get them to submit something in the online space that you can then give them that quality feedback on. So really personalizing that feedback for them.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Now, I'm going to jump to some questions here from our audience. And Nicole asks, sometimes timing has impacts for those with accessibility needs. And do you ever recommend a redesign of the assessment so that the actual assessment makes it impossible or harder to cheat?
So I guess one thing to note is you can't ever make it impossible, I would say, to cheat. Unfortunately, we can just reduce the risk that will happen.
Okay.
When we're thinking about accessibility concerns, though, and time limits on assessments, there are a lot of institutions that have some ability to request a longer time on a quiz through the accessibility services that are available on campus. So that's always something you can do. You can go in and, in the online space, give someone who has requested longer time on the quiz, longer time to do it, which kind of gets at that concern there. So I would say, yeah, if you have a learner who they know that they would take longer to even just read through questions and answer them, and they ask for that grace or that extension of the time, that we try to accommodate those learners as best we can, so that there isn't that added stress of trying to get through a test quicker than you think you can.
That's a good answer. Thank you. Now I've got a couple more questions we'll hit here, and then we'll move on. Mark asks, after the spring, I'm concerned that students are zoomed out, quote unquote, with synchronous delivery. What does the research say about the balance of asynchronous versus synchronous delivery in high quality online programs?
Yeah, so that's another really good question. I would say that from what I've seen in the literature and what I've heard from students that I've done interviews with, is that they really like the self-paced nature of having a mostly asynchronous course. Just because, there's a lot of room there for them to, and I'm getting ahead of myself because we're going to talk about this later, but there's room for them to work ahead if they need to, or revisit content as many times as they'd like. That being said, you could still have, I know people are probably zoomed out a little bit at this point, but you can still have scheduled sessions every once in a while that are synchronous. If you are doing that, though, I would highly encourage you to offer a couple of different time options, just because you may have people in different time zones or something just doesn't work with someone's schedule. And also recording those sessions, so if someone can't make it, you can see what was discussed as a class.
I like it. I'm going to do one more question, and then if I haven't gotten to your question, we will have time at the end of this session, and we can definitely swing back and hit those. So this sounds like an instructional designer. Deb asks, some avoid online teaching, right, and feel somewhat negatively towards instructional design support because they worry the recommended structuring and best practices, quote unquote, approach may limit their creativity and academic freedom. What are some great ways to recommend best practices without being too prescriptive? Right? Like you must have modules that look like this, or you must use our templates. Is there a better way to frame this issue?
Yeah, so great question. Something that I typically do, and that we do as a team, and on the team I'm on, is we'll make recommendations, which of course the subject matter expert has the choice to accept or not. But we frame them in, just as that, suggestions, recommendations based on those best practices. And something that I always do is I try to explain why it benefits the learner, why you should potentially consider taking a certain approach for that, increase in learning outcomes, increase in motivation. And I found that there are definitely people who are more receptive to that approach there, because you're keeping the focus on that on the learner. What is the learner getting out of this? But you might still run into, a little bit of pushback if there are some things that an instructor doesn't want to change in their course. And unfortunately, if they don't want to change it, that's what the course will stay like. But sometimes maybe they have a better understanding of their learners from having taught a few times. Maybe their learners actually do prefer it a certain way. So yeah, we're just making those suggestions and hoping that they take them.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Well, Darcy, let's move on here. I want to keep an eye on the clock here. We've got about 20 minutes left in our hour. Now, let's talk about the Q word. No, not a conspiracy theory. I want to use the word Q here for quality. So how do I address the topic of quality in online learning? How do I make sure my courses are quote unquote high quality? So, for example, my daughter took a few courses online, and frankly, after looking over her shoulder, they really didn't seem terribly engaging or high quality. Kind of reminded me of a correspondence course online, right? Is that good enough? Is that all online learning is?
So that is an experience that I've heard from quite a few people, and I actually saw some courses like that as a student myself when I was doing my degree, which it can understandably make some people hesitant to take online courses in the future. But I would say that those courses are the exception rather than the rule, thankfully. There's a lot you can do with online learning, and a lot you can do to make sure that you're offering learners that high quality, engaging learning experience online. And the 3 points here that are something I'd encourage you to think about when you're moving content online is how you can make sure that you're offering learners an engaging experience, a meaningful experience, and a flexible one. So with engagement, talking about this first, I know we already touched on a few of these things, so I won't spend too long on them to leave us more time for questions, but going back to that, text-based mixed media format, you can also think of the benefit of these formats more than just accommodating learner preferences. It also helps break up the content. So what research shows us about that is that it can really re-engage attention and keep learners engaged in the content to have those breaks built in there. We've talked about personalization a little bit already, so I won't get into those examples too much again here, but if you're already feeling good about using personalized feedback, offering learners some choice, and incorporating those reminders based on what they're doing in the course, you can start thinking about creating individual learner paths based on some sort of diagnostic assessment. So maybe you ask them at the beginning of the course what they're most interested in learning about, or what their base knowledge is going into a course, and kind of tailoring the content to them with those, what I'm going to call again, release conditions that way. Again, that might be more of a future goal thing, but still something to consider if you're feeling pretty solid about those other points we've talked about. And then for making things interactive, what I'm talking about here is keeping learners engaged through the use of those opportunities for practice, so formative activities or interactions built in throughout the content. So this, again, it helps keep their attention on key points, and it gives them that chance to kind of self-assess, see where they might need to revisit content, see where they're already doing well. And it makes things more memorable too. If I'm going through a course and I hit a practice assessment and I get something wrong, I'm going to remember that and come back to it and revisit it. And this section is a little bit lengthier, of course, so if anyone does have questions, feel free to keep popping those in the chat for us too. So when we're thinking about meaningful, I know this can sometimes be a loaded term, but what I mean here is, first of all, making sure that everything is clear to the learner. So how do your learning outcomes align with the content, the activities, the assessments? And also when we're talking about making things clear, this also covers making sure that everything is fully explained to learners online. So think about the sticking points you've seen in the classroom and make sure to unpack them. because when you're in the online space, a learner can't just stop you and ask a question like they could in the classroom. So you want to really make sure that you're explaining everything. And then just touching on the other 2 points here, relevant, reducing noise. So try to avoid, redundancy and tangential topics, but keeping that content concise and focused on exactly what it is you want learners to be able to do at the end of the course.
Mm.
Yeah, so the benefit of that is that it makes it easier for learners to attend to key information, first of all, and it reduces the likelihood they're going to burn out or disengage from the content too. And then related to that, so the applied piece here, so really this just means, taking that content and making it applied, making it something that has some real world application or example built in there. And this can be really helpful for if we're thinking about a topic like math or something else with a lot of complex, abstract content. This can help learners ground the learning in concrete examples and make it easier for them to remember and apply.
Gotcha.
And then moving on to the flexible piece, I know we talked about self-paced a bit, so I won't touch on that too much here. Really what we've talked about before was, making sure that the content is, there's some asynchronous content, but you can also have opportunity for that synchronous content in there, and then just making sure that you do have a recording available to learners or a few options of when they could pop in. But you also want to think about making things chunked out a bit shorter in terms of the length of a topic as well, to make it easier for learners to kind of take that in on the go or take breaks as they're going through it. And then I'm just going to skip over personalized because we've talked about that quite a bit already with the questions as well. But when we're talking about accessibility, this is such a key point for online learning. It would take an entire other session or two to actually really talk through this, so I'm not going to say too much about it, but I encourage you all to look into universal design and accessibility to make sure that you're creating a learning experience, a quality learning experience that's considering universal design principles. So for example, are you adding text alternatives for visual content that could be read by a screen reader? Do the videos that you're including in the course have transcripts? That kind of thing. So that was a lot of content there. Yeah.
No, that's okay. That's all right. There was a lot of good content in there, and I'm going to be I'm keeping an eye on the time here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to bring it on home, Darcy, and tell us about 3 to 5 of the most important things your experience has taught you about transitioning face-to-face courses online and assisting faculty become more fluent in online learning environments.
Yeah, so the first thing I would say there is don't try to reinvent the wheel. So make use of the curated content that you already have as a base to get started. And think of ways that you can instead take that content, maybe make it more concise, make it more interactive to best engage your learners online. Also, I would say that designing content up front, which we talked about when we were talking about instructor presence, it gives you more room to focus on building that connection with your learners, engaged with them throughout a course. And survey tools, we touched on this a bit in that, after a course section, I would encourage you to take advantage of survey tools or other ways to check in with learners to improve on course design, which is particularly important when you're just getting started. And then that last point there, kind of related to the survey tools point, but I recommend thinking of the course design process as something that's iterative. Do the best you can with the time you have available the first time you're getting your content online, and then just continue to make improvements as you go.
That makes sense. I like that. And I'm a big fan of the survey too. I've learned so much from surveying my students, both at the midterm in the course as well as at the end, and make sure that I'm staying on, focus if I'm missing anything. And I think that's always been real important, besides just doing a test, to figure out what they're missing. Just to ask my students, what am I missing here? And they're terribly candid. So I find that really helpful. Well, Again, Darcy, thanks so much for sharing those. And I know that there's some resources that you've put together that we've put in our slides here that for folks who are participating will get a copy of these slides and can access these resources as well. Is there anything in here that, as you think of a highlight, that things or a resource that you think folks really should zoom in on, or is one of your favorites?
Yeah, so for just getting started, I would say that that second one there, the creating an online course, a step-by-step guide, is a great starting point. Once you're starting to think about, taking your course to the next level and other best practices you can consider, that's where I'd say to start focusing on the rest of those points there.
Gotcha. No, that's wonderful. So let's, we've got about a little under 10 minutes left. And I want to go through some more questions here before we wrap up for the day. So here's an interesting question. It says, Deb says, I try to avoid allowing students to access module materials more than 2 or 3 days in advance because I want to maintain a feel of community. How flexible is too flexible or too self-paced, like a telecourse? It's an interesting question.
That is an interesting question. Yeah, something I would say about that is I have gotten feedback from learners before and heard from faculty elsewhere that if content isn't all readily available to them right off the bat for an online course, sometimes they can find that a bit frustrating. So because of the self-paced nature of online learning, I would say that having most of the core content available for them to skim through early if they want to is useful, but you can also build in those checkpoints that are time related. So maybe you have a weekly discussion that they have to participate in with their peers, and they have to respond to a certain number of their peers as well, so that you're showing that they're still in there and active when their peers are posting as well. Or you could build in those, like we've mentioned a few times here, those little check-ins that are synchronous, so those video conference sessions.
Well, that's good. I like that. I've got a great question here from Jax Badney. And Jax asks, I teach theater design courses, which are traditionally face-to-face since theater is a live art form. What techniques might you have for developing distance learning courses that are arts hands-on creative courses?
That is a very, very good question. Yeah, so for online, you can think about using something like a portfolio that learners share with each other. I don't know what you would typically do in your theater design courses, but maybe you have those portfolios that learners are sharing. You can have, I'm thinking more of this from a fine arts perspective, but a gallery walk or some sort of show and tell of talking through what they did, talking through their portfolio, and then maybe they get some peer feedback on that too. So that's maybe one creative online way of doing that. I know there's a lot being done too with starting to explore virtual reality, and there are some programs available through, even with your cell phone, you can get Google Glasses or something like that, so it's not as much of a heavy lift, but letting learners, virtually walk through a theater. That's, of course, next level, but something to consider looking into if there are resources available online already and you don't have to create anything yourself.
Oh, yeah, I threw you a curveball on that one. That was a good question, Jax.
It was, yeah.
And we've got time for one more here, and I'm gonna share another one with you. This is more of a get your thoughts on. This is from Wendy Flint, and Wendy asks, at our university, we are going to a flex plan in the fall, which means that we create a hybrid programs where we teach in the classroom to a small group of students along with a hybrid online program, but also with live video access while teaching. And she's asking, Wendy asks, what are your thoughts about that?
That is a very open question. So I think that gives you some room there to have a nice mix of both those benefits of being in the classroom, but also maybe building in some of those interactive pieces online that learners can do before they come in into the class and, get together and start talking about the content with one another. The video recording of the classroom is an interesting piece. I don't know if I can ask you a follow-up question, but is the idea here that the students would all be there in person and it would be recorded for them to view later on, or will there be some people at a distance while some of them are in the classroom?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. That might be one that we could follow up on online or via email. And as you can see, we've got our email addresses here available. There's darcy.white@d2l, and you can reach me at christopher.sessoms@d2l.com. And again, I want to sort of be conscious of the time here. And I'm going to wrap it up here, if you don't mind, Darcy. And participants, folks that are attending here, if we didn't get to your question, I think we have a copy of those, and Darcy and I will be happy to follow up with you on those. So thank you again for the questions, and thank you everybody for participating today. And Darcy, I want to thank you again for joining us as we sort through the online wheat from the chaff. And again, thank you for those listening and participating in our session. I hope that what you heard today you found useful and informative. And again, feel free to drop Darcy or I a line anytime, and we're happy to follow up with you there.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris and Darcy. Really appreciate you both taking the time and sharing your expertise with us. Yes, just a quick note, if you didn't get your question answered, thanks to everybody who submitted your questions. We got a lot of questions submitted in the Q&A here. We will gather all those, and someone will be following up with everybody afterwards. Yes, we did get a couple questions asking about accessing the slides and the recording, and yes, we will be sending a follow-up email with links to those. So you'll be able to go back over it, share with anyone at your institution or your faculty later on, so don't worry about that. Yes, on behalf of all of us here at University Business, thank you so much for joining us today. Hope you found our presentation and discussion informative and useful to you. Producing webinars like this one is just part of our mission here at UB to inform college and university leaders like you about the latest news and trends in higher ed management. You'll find more coverage about issues such as the ones we discussed here in the pages of our print magazine, as well as our website and digital edition, through additional webinars like this one, and through our various e-newsletters, which you can sign up for right from our website. And just another quick note here, as I mentioned before, if you would like to view the archive recording, we will archive the recording on our website at the URL on your screen, and just keep an eye out for that thank you email that everyone will receive with links to the recording as well as the slides, and be able to access those later on. So that is it for today's event. Once again, I'm Kurt Osley-Durley for University Business on behalf of everyone here at UB and our sponsor for today, D2L. Thank you so much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.